Have you ever tried to express an idea? Well, of course you have, it's kind of a rhetoric question, but well, in doing so, you have become a translator. A translator people don't usually think about, one who translates thoughts into words. But has it ever been difficult for you to express these ideas appropriately, in words that would connect with your audience? Well, this is one of the problems with translation. Sometimes things don't come up as we expect them to, nor does the receiver understand our original message. Well, today we'll learn how a message gets twisted in translation, be it through languages, adaptations, when putting thoughts into words and perceiving the world. At the end, we'll have some tips to help you express yourself and your ideas more effectively. Let's start with the example when everyone thinks about translation. So, when talking about a language translation, don't make the mistake of thinking that these ideas apply only to translations between languages though. These can be, to an extent, extrapolated and give us an insight into human thought and interpretation, which will be expanded upon later. Anyways, there are plenty of theories about translation, which tell us some of the ideas about how people translate, including some of the thought process behind languages. So, even if this book focuses mostly on the pedagogy of translations, this section shows a summary of some theories that analyze how the mental process of translation works. I wouldn't blame you if you're too lazy to read it, so here are some short summaries and my opinion. First, let's talk about the semiotic theory. This one argues that translation can be understood in terms of signs, which can be words, ideas, and context, which are interchangeable between two systems or languages. Its effectiveness relies on how equivalent these signs are. The theory argues that human translation is a creative process, since translation requires one knowing both sign systems and considering how to transfer interchangeably between both systems, adjusting for context, words, and ideas that sometimes only exist in one of the systems. I believe that this theory is very interesting, in the realm of machine learning especially, but it's hard to evaluate the effectiveness of a translation, even with a machine that interprets information untainted by personal experiences. It seems a useful theory for more theory-heavy or pragmatic texts that don't require much special transformation structure-wise, compared to metric for poems, say. Next, the interpretive theory states that a translator's job is to extract the pure meaning from a work, which is done by first understanding the ideas, abstracting them, and then expressing them in the new language. This is done through a three-step process of comprehension, deverbalization, and reformulation. The theory argues that comprehension doesn't depend on language, which is why meaning can be deverbalized and then transformed. I believe this theory is very neat, explaining why translations differ as translators interpret and extract meaning differently, and then use different words and ideas to express them in a new language. I also think that the idea of deverbalization is true, and I wonder if it can be extrapolated into a monolinguistic context. We can connect the ideas in the theory to the article Will Humanity Get Lost in Translation, written by Nilanjana. She argues that the process of abstraction is where personal interpretation comes in, and effective interpretations require passion and a real understanding of the work and its ideas, which is mostly true for non-theoretical or merely philosophical texts. There's also the linguistic theory, which states that translation can be understood purely in terms of linguistics, and translations themselves should only be done considering the linguistic context, which encompasses grammar, form, meaning, etc. The theory believes that the best translations try to maintain a similar form or structure and produce the same effect in the readers in the translation as they do in the original version. I believe that theory limits itself too much in the contextual aspect, as it doesn't consider the impact that society and its context has on the message in the text. It still holds very strong for theory-heavy and pragmatical texts, of course, and it makes it easier for translators in these fields. Next, the sociolinguistic theory englobes the linguistic aspect of the aforementioned theory, but it doesn't limit itself to linguistics, as it considers the social context behind works too. It argues that the meaning behind a text relies both on these aspects, and it cannot be understood solely through one of these lenses, as they work together. The limits of this theory, however, are in the methodological aspect and the limited applicability for theory-heavy or pragmatic text. I believe this theory is very effective at settling how meaning arises from a work and its context, with the book explaining its limitations. The theory explains in clear terms the ideas of the semiotic theory while adding why these signs have meaning. When connected to another personal experience, the article Translation as an Arithmetic of Loss by Urjas Contreras Ingrid explains the importance of cultural nuance when trying to effectively convey meaning. The article builds upon this theory by adding the concept of simultaneous interpretation, how personal nuance is necessary when translating ideas to a reduced community. This creates a more meaningful experience by adapting the message to fit the community's experiences and beliefs. The last theory in the book is about principles and pedagogy. This one focuses on the framework around translation, trying to set rules that aren't as general nor specific to create a good basis for most types of translation, which definitely aligns with the purpose of the book, but not so much for this video, so goodbye, I guess. Well, you might have thought this was over, but there's this one human who talks about more theories about translation. In the lecture by Belloc, he proposes that methods and rules for translating, which are not relevant for this video, give many interesting ideas, however. Some of them are Belloc's beliefs of a translation's purpose. He states, "The end of translation is the production of a work in a certain language." He also proposes that the best translations aren't tainted by any foreign language, as they should stand as powerful, authentic work in the new language. This is why he thinks that the best translations come not from bilinguals, but from people who understand the new language, without tainting the translation with the original language's idioms. He too says that we shouldn't constrain translators by the original parameters of the work. For example, the metrical or rhymes of a poem, and a translated version shouldn't be limited by the originals. Finally, he talks about the abstraction of the language when translating, connected to the interpretive theory. He states that the translation has obviously to know both the tongue in which he translates and the tongue from which he translates, but he also has to possess a sort of shadowy tongue, the wraith of a composite language, a mysterious idiom which combines the two, acts as a bridge, and permits him to pass continuously from one to the other. Continuing with this rather hefty section already, I'll say that these are only the theories of translation. It is important to consider how different languages can shape the way we think, thus shaping the shadow language we'll talk about more later. There are some resources that analyze this phenomenon, but for this video we'll consider neuroscientist Lera Boroditsky's TED Talk, How Languages Shape the Way We Think. I'd love to read her book, but let's say that 330 pages are slightly outside the video's allowed time budget, so, well, in the talk, she talks about 5 broad ways in which she considers language to shape our thoughts. I will be using her example, so if you're interested in it, go check out her talk. First, it can alter our perception of time and space. She gives the example of an Aboriginal tribe in Australia that only has words for cardinal directions, north, east, south, and west, not relative directions like left or right. Naturally, they have a much better spatial awareness, and when ordering photos of a person's life from youngest to oldest, they did it relative to the east-west direction, while people who spoke languages that write from left to right did so this way, and analogous for people who write right to left. Then, she considers languages with a number system, with words with which we can count, which are numbered languages, and this opens the whole world of mathematics through algebra, which isn't possible in numberless languages without the introductions of this concept. She also argues that languages can alter our perception in a more instinctive manner. For example, Russian doesn't have other translation of the word blue, they have name for the shades of blue that we deem blue, unless we go specific like deep blue, which are just modifiers of the base word. This means that they can more instinctively and easily recognize these different shades. After that, she talks about gender languages. The example she gives is between two gender languages with opposing genders in a noun. In German, a bridge is female, while in Spanish it is male. In this case, it might affect how we perceive these nouns as a collective, usually attributing characteristics traditionally considered male or female. Finally, she talks about how languages influences what we believe about an event. For example, in English, when someone accidentally breaks a vase, we assign the blame in the sentence itself. They broke the vase, where we might add accidentally if we feel kind enough. However, in other languages the phrase might translate more accurately as the vase was broken, maybe with accidentally appended. This affects how we assign blame and how we think about incidents and whether there is someone to blame in accidents. To summarize what we learned from this section, well, let's see, as a translator, I think you've learned and reflected about how translations work and the process in which one gathers ideas from a text and extrapolates them to another language. You might have learned how your thoughts might be influenced by the languages you speak. As a regular person, however, one learned that translation is a tricky process, but the ideas behind it can apply to other forms of communication. For example, telling an anecdote to a group of friends won't be the same as doing so to your family, As these two groups care about different things, their context changes, so the purpose is likely different for each. You might also learn how cultures and people might have different thoughts simply because of the language differences.
Although the Lyle theories make sense between languages, what happens when we translate from the mind to the natural world? Belloc gives an interesting concept, the shadowy tongue. The shadowy tongue is where two languages meet each other in the form of pure ideas in the translator's mind. And I understand Belloc's point, especially that which states that it is harder to write translations as a bilingual since your mind thinks, from our experience, in both languages simultaneously, or in the shadowy tongue. This makes it really hard for translators to create the same feeling of an original work, as we're likely to get confused between idioms and find an exact translation of ideas. Since we can express ourselves in both languages, you don't have the restriction of one language. This connects directly to the concept of untranslatable phrases and words, which require a lot of creativity to express in other languages. It's like explaining a meme to a person who is not on the internet all the time, or a situation to a friend who wasn't there. Moving to Belloc's next point, he poses the idea that a translation should be a powerful, standalone original work. To me, that feels like the translator doesn't pay the tribute to the original work. However, this only stands for mostly philosophical works that don't require a significant stylistic adaptation, and thus more creativity, but require a focus on the ideas given by the original work. This is also why I agree with Dolan's point on style, where translators shouldn't be limited by the original work's parameters, as translations tend to be longer than the original work, which affects the ability to work under the same constraints. Belloc's last idea is that thinking does not need a language, although it does make it harder for one to develop ideas without a language. I wonder whether this idea can be extracted to monolinguistic context though, since there are people like Orwell who oppose this idea, or at least disagree with it to an extent. However, the context of Belloc's and the interpretive theory of language have a different context in which I agree with the idea of a shadow tongue existing. Since how else would one be able to abstract meaning from a language and transform it into another one if there's no intermediary tongue in the process? I see the point behind the semiotic approach, but I'd argue that where creativity comes from in this theory, it's where the shadow tongue appears, as they posit that there's no singular way to translate a text, showing where the translator's own interpretation and use of their shadow tongue comes in. A good example of this could be people who are born with deaf blindness. They can still form thoughts, but it does not exist in any language. They do so in terms of feeling and tact. In our case, the shadowy tongue expresses itself at the time of writing these videos or communicating between one another. Since there are some words or expressions that do not exist in English or Spanish, we take words from English and plunge them into a Spanish sentence, or vice versa. More interestingly, since I have been a bilingual for most of my life, I have no need to translate English to Spanish when it comes to reading, since I fully understand the words and the meaning of them, except on some rare occasions where I do not know a word or a phrase. In my brother's case, he believes that he's always had the shadowy tongue ever since he remembers being bilingual. At the start, he used to translate from Spanish to English without abstracting the concept, as he learned words from Spanish instead of knowing what they mean, so every word that he learned is just another way to say something in Spanish. However, once you get the hang of a language, you start understanding what you're actually saying and you start translating. At that point, it was easier to just use Spanglish, because you reach the level in which you only need to translate what was needed. And that meant he was able to use a shadow tongue now, where he abstracts the concepts instead of the words directly, and it makes for a more accurate translation because of untranslatable words and phrases. Hey, I just wanted to drop in and thank you for watching the video so far. And if you're enjoying it or learning something new, it will help us out a lot if you liked it and subscribe to the channel. We are trying to keep a monthly schedule over here. No AI, no anything. We do all of the scripting, we do all of the editing and all of the recordings ourselves. And even with the schedules of a full-time video editor and a college student, we're trying to keep this monthly schedule. So please feel free to go back to our previous video or look forward to the next one. And thank you for watching.
But before sharing our ideas, we must first internalize them. This is what we call the translation between the natural world to our mind. In a monolinguistic context, Orwell's Newspeak appendix on 1984 and his Politics and the English Language essay argue how language and the thoughts are interconnected.
In the first instance, he goes so far as to argue that it can limit the range of our thoughts, as Newspeak means to do for citizens in the Paris of 1984.
We will explain this in detail here, so if you're familiar with Newspeak, feel free to skip to these timestamps. So, the purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of Ingsoc, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. It was intended that when Newspeak had been adopted once and for all, and all speak forgotten, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of Ingsoc, should be literally unthinkable, at least so far as thought is dependent on words. To achieve this goal, Orwell argues that there's two principles that must be followed. The first one is destroying nuance by the elimination of synonyms, and the next one is putting many undesirable thoughts under the same umbrella term, making citizens unable to understand, express, and defend ideas that do not really favor the party. Briefly said, Orwell thinks, in this case,
Language completely shapes thought.
Next, in his essay, he explains how thought and language can corrupt each other. He argues that modern, as in 1946 modern, English hinders our thought capacity. He says that this happens through the following means: the use and creation of ready-made phrases, metaphors that no longer provoke thought in the reader nor writer, excessive wording, pretentious diction, be it fancy, jargony, and scientific wording to express simple ideas or things, and the use of meaningless words that have been used in so many discourses and contexts that they are stripped of their original meaning. He goes on to create a list of rules for effective writing, which he argues shouldn't be followed strictly, as following them religiously might have a counterproductive effect. I believe that Orwell developed Newspeak and its rules through the observations on modern English, creating a very vivid and realistic language that could potentially develop from how English had evolved, of course under a totalitarian government with these in its interest. What is interesting about these is that, according to Orwell and ourselves, language can limit our range of thoughts. However, the existence of language itself proves our point wrong, since at some point humans collectively shape their thoughts into sounds and words. This is because language itself is a form in which a group of people can express thoughts and share ideas that are important to a community. Language is a collective effort to facilitate communication by taking abstract multimodal thoughts and putting them into a less abstract, shareable concepts with agreed general meaning. Comparing these to 1984's context, there's no tangible community that needs to express certain ideas, such as the Brotherhood and anything unorthodox, making it impossible to share or shape your thoughts and ideas. It is especially hard to think of these ideas in the first place because Newspeak is shaped in a way that these thoughts need to be invented, as they don't exist in the language. Because we think the purpose of language is voicing the needs of a community, words get constantly added, removed, and modified to align with the community. This leads to the development of sub-languages, regional differences, and the evolution of language, of course. And this is why the concepts are more accurately shared between smaller communities and people who are closer to each other, since the shared experiences and knowledge about each other helps cater the message to be as accurate as possible. It is why we create sub-languages and words with people we are the closest to. In the same way that words are a less abstract form of thoughts, thoughts can be an abstracted form of words. As aforementioned, thoughts are multimodal, so you think of the noun lemon and try to abstract the word and decipher its meaning. While the general agreed upon definition is a yellow oval citrus fruit with thick skin and fragrant acidic juice, but they're just more words. When abstracted, you can think of the shape, color, taste, recipes, and other aspects of a lemon in the way in which you can sense a lemon. The thought of a lemon gets abstracted differently according to a person, but the definition is just close enough to the abstraction to facilitate our communication. For example, in our family and in Spanish, particularly in northwest of Mexico, the word for lemon is also utilized to describe the lime, leading to confusion when discussing whether we're making limeade or lemonade. So, just like every other way of communication, be it painting, music, poems, sculptures, etc., the interpretation of the receiver plays an important role. It is why with smaller communities we have more specific ways to voice our thoughts and we limit interpretation and use it in our favor. In contrast, broader audiences give different interpretations because of less accurate but more broadly understandable concepts in the form of words. In neither context would two people get the same information from a sentence, but the bigger the community, the less similar the information they get. What we have learned is that when people tell you to mind your words, all these becomes more important, since the whole process of talking to another person goes from your mind to a natural world, then to a natural world of your receiver, and then it is translated again into their mind. Try thinking again about how you would say what you are thinking to yourself, and then how you will explain it better to your recipient. If this seems tricky, because of course it is, we're just talking about words and thoughts right now. When different mediums of communication get involved, translation gets even trickier.
As an avid consumer of comic books and comic book movies, I have dived into the landscape of friendly internet discussions regarding which adaptation of a character is better. One recurring argument that I see a lot is that a certain adaptation is better than the other just because it is more comic accurate, referring to things happening as similarly as possible as in the original comic book. The thing is, this argument has always appeared silly to me, because different media have different purposes, audiences, and delivery methods. Charles Harris expands on this as a guest in the From Page to Screen podcast. Harris explains that while interesting characters are a factor in a successful screenplay from a novel, it is whether the novel has a clear through line or plot or it doesn't. Books can afford you to give a richer experience with the thoughts of the protagonist, supporting characters, subplots, and everything else. Movies have to show you everything. Quoting Harris, and I quote, "In a good book, the authorial voice is largely what holds you in the book. It gives you a sense of what's going on. You can film a beautiful desert landscape, but you don't get the beautiful words in the book that brought it to life." End quote. Comic books are a little bit more interesting and maybe why they are easier to adapt into movies, since comic books have actual images that accompany the story. You still lose the voice of the character, of course. A big part of Spider-Man are his long thought bubbles, especially those in the 1960s and 70s. A big part of what I like about Spider-Man in the 60s and 70s, though, was how fun the interactions between characters and how the struggle of the double life of Peter Parker plays out in interesting ways. Him not getting the girl, him wanting to do good, but being affected negatively by doing the right thing, etc. In Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1 and 2, we miss a huge amount of details that could definitely enrich the story, but would have needed about 10 movies to fully develop. In the comics, Peter first dates Betty Brant way before even knowing Mary Jane existed. Betty Brant and the Daily Bugle barely make an appearance in the movies because they do not help the overall plot of the movie. The Daily Bugle could be cut entirely from the first Spider-Man movie, and not much would have changed. In fact, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man barely mentions the Bugle, and Tom Holland's Spider-Man movies mention it up until his third movie, and it could still be any news medium who published the story either way, since a big part of the Bugle is Spider-Man working there. Evidently, the three of these adaptations do different things and none of them are 100% comic accurate, but people still like or dislike them either way. Another point to consider has to be the different amounts of interactivity in each media. Books suffered the least, while VR and video games are the ones able to give you the most interactivity. Let's take Spider-Man as an example again. In the comic book, you just see pictures of Spider-Man swinging. In the movies, you get to see Spider-Man actively swinging, and it's a little bit easier to put yourself in his place. In the video games, and as many reviews highlight, you get to feel like Spider-Man when swinging, which is a big thing to nail in Spider-Man games for fans, because it is one of the things that people want to do most when thinking of Spider-Man's powers. The difference between mediums makes adaptations a difficult task. You need to pick and choose what works from the original source and what will work or not in the media you're adapting it into. Belloc's ideas about translation fit perfectly here. He explains that although you need to be inspired by the original source, you need to create an almost independent work from the original piece. Because of this, I think it is unfair to compare an adaptation from the original source since it would be considered a new work. Because of their delivery methods, books are a little bit more internal and experienced as a mix between the ideas, wording, and context of the writer, and the reader's thoughts, interpretation, and imagination. On the other hand, movies are external and there is less room for the watcher's imagination, though interpretation, just like in every medium, is present and changes according to the receiver's context and experiences.
Well, the completely hypothetical nature of this section means that we have different interpretations, so you probably even have another one, which you should definitely share in the comments below. Anyways, there's no definitive answer to this, and of course there's no authoritative resources to work with, so let's start with what I think. In my mind, telepathy will be the ability to share thoughts and ideas without losing any information. The hard part is figuring out how we would achieve all these. In my opinion, the only way to achieve this is getting all of the context behind an idea, both conscious and subconscious. This will be a lot, and I mean a lot of information, even for thoughts that we might think are relevant. For example, what if we wanted to share that we don't like lemons? Well, we have to understand why someone consciously and subconsciously doesn't like lemons. Well, maybe when they were 3 years old, a drop of lemon juice fell on their eye and now they subconsciously dislike lemons. But they could also enjoy lemonade, but only when it has sparkling water and they give it a 6 out of 10 rating in this case, considering their own subjective scaling, which makes them not completely hate lemons. You might see where this is going. Yes, it's going to every single experience that influence their opinion, which are, well, plenty of experiences, but I'd also accept if it would only be the conscious aspects that mold their opinion at that moment, because otherwise it might make you understand their ideas even better than they do, in which case you might gain something from translation instead of losing it, which sounds completely insane and it will break the purpose of this video. I wonder, however, if getting off this person's experience would change your own opinion and destroy your free thought. Well, I believe it wouldn't, because it would just make you empathize and understand why they think what they do, and not make you believe it. For example, I might understand why my brother thinks the drum solo at the end of Whiplash wasn't worth it, even if I disagree with him. Reference to the uh, video like of a year ago, only real train of thoughts fan will understand. But well, I perfectly understand it, unlike real life empathy where it's only partial, even if I don't agree with it. In this case, I think telepathy would fundamentally change research and education and our ability to empathize. Let me illustrate with an example. Say Albert Einstein is respawn and he unifies quantum mechanics and general relativity, he would then be able to share all of the ideas and the method of how he did these through telepathy, greatly simplifying our ability to share knowledge. However, new researchers might be able to prove or disprove what he did by spotting mistakes, or by working upon the new theory. Furthermore, sharing this idea to a second grader would make Einstein 2 at like 10 years, which is crazy. I mean, imagine trying to explain like quantum physics in terms that a second grader would understand. But well, now moving on to empathy, I think it is easier. In another example, telepathy would easily breach polarization in the cases where people haven't tried to empathize with each other, or where they fail because of insufficient information or knowledge about the other side. Here, they would by definition empathize by understanding the other side, and even if they don't change their mind, they would at least most likely diminish the degree of polarization of or aggression to the other side. However, in cases where people fight for the simple purpose of fighting, then it is impossible even if they can completely empathize. Finally, I think that the way this would work is by giving someone full access to the extent of your thought, along with the capacity to understand the ideas relevant to it. It would also work by giving the thoughts and ideas in a way that one could understand them, like I said, how it would be insane to explain the unification with apples and oranges, but well, this would instantly address the problem of how different languages shape the way we think and our inability to understand another person's experiences. I wonder if this very hypothetical ability would work with more than one person though, in which case education would be completely irrelevant by teaching every relevant subject via an expert.
I was going to say I disagreed with Pucci since I was concerned with just how mind reading actually works. My biggest issue would be, how does mind reading happen? Do you read it like a book? Do you experience the thoughts? Do you hear a voice? If you hear a voice, is it in the shadowy tongue where you just understand the concepts? Do you see the person thinking and going through a scenario? What if a person is thinking of a memory? Do you feel the memory as if it were your own? Do you see it in a third person? Is it downloaded into your mind as your own, and therefore you feel the same emotions as the other person felt? All very confusing and intriguing questions I may never have an answer. The closest I think I can get to mind reading, or in essence copying and pasting thoughts, feelings, or concepts from one mind to another, is the article "Scientists Made Snails Remember Something That Never Happened to Them." The snails from this experiment were shocked and were observed to retract their siphon for longer than a regular unshocked snail after a couple of shocks. The experiment attempted to give a recipient snail RNA from a donor snail that has been shocked several times already. To their surprise, the recipient snail showed to retract their siphon for longer than an untrained snail, almost as if they were trained. In this case, obviously, the snails are not reading the mind from the other snails, but let's assume that when you are reading a mind, you basically learn the thoughts or feelings of the person you're reading the mind from and the reason behind them. In this case, no information should be lost, but I think something important could also be lost. Let's imagine that I read the mind of a person who says that the Whopper is beautiful than a beautiful double Western bacon. If I read it and understand absolutely all of the reasons why they like a Whopper over a double Western bacon, which is heresy, would I also agree with that statement from now on? I guess I could rethink it, and just like I said right now, that is preposterous. But in that same way, we can just accept new facts just like that, especially if we are not knowledgeable in the area. I'm a double Western bacon expert, so I know that the Whopper can't be better. In this context, it is not very important, but let's imagine that someone discovers a new virus and finds one way to kill it. All researchers read his mind and take it as a fact. And it's even easier since you can quote-unquote read a mind by reading their research papers and agreeing or disagreeing. If everybody takes it as a fact, then no one continues the research and we may miss out on a better way to fight the virus just because we all take our base knowledge as an absolute truth. I see reading minds and taking everything for granted as a trade-off, as we gain complete understanding of experiences from other human beings and their reasoning, but we might be able to lose part of our own need and natural curiosity by just accepting things as they are and conforming ourselves to a status quo. Of course, with this example, we can't force another person to read our thoughts or conform to our own opinions and thoughts. And I think that's what makes us special. This freedom comes with a cost. Outright harmful and wrong opinions are a big threat to the public, even if they don't appear to be so. Misinformation and contrarian beliefs just for the sake of being a contrarian can end in sharing outright wrong information, and the propagation of that are harmful for minorities or attain to the goals of one individual manipulating the information that they share. And again, it is up to us to challenge and question these stances in order to defend what is true and what is right. Communicating between one another is still a big challenge that requires tons of brain power, listening, empathy, and understanding. Even if we fully comprehend the words and the ideas behind a person, there's quite a lot of room to misinterpret and alter a message that another person is sending us. Messages can also be distorted, information withheld, or fed in the form of fallacies with the intent of turning us towards a direction or manipulating us. On a similar end, fully understanding a message can turn us into conformity and the full acceptance of an opinion or a partial fact as an absolute truth. We must have the courage to challenge these absolute truths when needed, and decide whether we want to keep improving things or conform with what we have. Mind readers or not, knowledge is already being shared to a degree where there is little to no room for things to be lost in translation. After all, we believe that the scientific spirit and the freedom of thought will persevere as it always has done. Even if one day we're fully able to get into the mind of another person, which might threaten our individuality and hinder the creativity that has driven us to the point at which we find ourselves now. But so long as we choose to remain curious, everything should be fine.